6:18 a.m., 25,000 feet above the sea. The air over Malta didn't feel like oxygen. It felt like hot, pressurized sand. Inside the cockpit of Red 2, George Beurling wasn't breathing. He was sipping at the air, trying to keep his lungs from seizing. His chest burned. His stomach was a knotted mass of agony. The Malta dog dysentery was liquefying his insides, a slow-motion rot that had already claimed 20 pounds of his muscle. He was a skeleton wrapped in sweat-soaked Nomex, held together by nothing but adrenaline and a terrifying, singular focus. On the ground at Takali, a controller named Miller leaned into his headset, his knuckles white against the desk. "Red 2, check your spacing. You're drifting, George. Get back in the slot." Static. A hollow, rhythmic hiss was the only reply. On the radar screen, the formation was a neat, disciplined line of grease pencil marks, except for one. Red 2 was sliding away. It looked like a mistake. It looked like a pilot passing out from hypoxia. It looked like a death sentence. "Red 2, ground. Rejoin immediately. You are unprotected. Do you copy?" Beurling heard the voice. It sounded small, distant, like a memory of a world that didn't matter anymore. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand and clicked the radio off. The silence that followed was louder than the Merlin engine. It was the silence of a man stepping off a cliff. He wasn't drifting. He was hunting. Beurling glanced at his reflection in the grime-streaked glass of the canopy. His eyes were bloodshot, the pupils blown wide. He looked insane because, by any rational military standard, he was. He had spent the previous night not sleeping, but staring at a series of hand-drawn diagrams, logarithmic spirals, bullet trajectories, the physics of a snapshot. Most pilots in the RAF flew by the book. They stayed in their pairs. They watched each other's tails. They lived by the collective. Beurling hated the collective. The collective was slow. The collective was predictable. He eased the throttle back. The Spitfire groaned, the airframe vibrating as speed bled off. He watched his wingmen, the rational men, climb toward the sun, their silhouettes shrinking against the blinding Mediterranean blue. They were looking for a fight. Beurling was looking for the math. He knew the Germans better than they knew themselves. He knew that at 6:20 a.m., a staffel of Messerschmitt 109s would be crossing the coast at 24,000 feet. They would see the RAF formation. They would see the easy climb. They would dive, confident in their energy advantage. He also knew they wouldn't look down. Not yet. He pushed the stick forward, just an inch. The Spitfire's nose dipped, sliding him into the dead zone, the shimmering, hazy layer of heat where the sky met the sea. Below him, Malta was a scarred rock, a graveyard of limestone and ancient dust. Above him, the hunters were arriving. The first flicker of silver appeared at 10 o'clock high. Then 4 more. They were dropping like stones, their Daimler-Benz engines screaming as they converted altitude into lethal speed. Miller's voice exploded in the headsets of the other pilots, the ones who were still listening. "Vandals, 12 o'clock high, break, break now!" The sky turned into a kaleidoscope of tracers and turning metal. The RAF pilots hauled their sticks back, grunting against the G-force, desperate to turn their noses toward the threat. They were reacting. They were afraid. Beurling was calm. He was sitting at 12,000 feet, a mile below the chaos, watching the lead Messerschmitt blow past the main formation. The German pilot was good. Too good. He had missed his primary target and was already leveling out, preparing to use his excess speed to zoom back into the safety of the clouds. He was coming right for Beurling's dead zone. The German didn't see the lone Spitfire. Why would he? No one sat at 12,000 feet, unescorted, motionless in the sky. Beurling didn't use his sights. Not yet. He closed his left eye, calculating the lead. Target airspeed, 380 knots. My airspeed, 140 knots. Angle of deflection, 48 degrees. It was a shot that shouldn't exist. It was a snap. A fraction of a second where the two flight paths would intersect at a nearly perpendicular angle. If he fired a millisecond too early, he'd miss. A millisecond too late, and the Germans' 20-millimeter cannons would shred the Spitfire's thin skin. Beurling's heart rate slowed. His finger hovered over the gun button. The Messerschmitt grew in his vision. It wasn't a plane anymore. It was a vector, a problem to be solved. 500 yards, 400. The German pilot finally saw him. Beurling saw the Messerschmitt's elevators flicker, the sudden panicked jerk of a man who realizes he has flown into a trap. It was too late. Beurling didn't just fire. He placed the bullets where the German was going to be. Thud, thud, thud. The Spitfire bucked as the Hispano cannon spoke. It was a 2-second burst, a surgical strike. The rounds didn't hit the wings. They didn't hit the tail. They went straight through the cockpit glass. The Messerschmitt didn't burn. It just stopped. The pilot was gone before he could scream. The plane continued its trajectory for a heartbeat, a ghost ship made of steel, before the nose dropped and it began a slow, terminal tumble toward the waves. Beurling didn't watch it hit. He didn't have time for ego. "One," he whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. Suddenly, the sky around him was no longer empty. The rest of the German staffel had seen their leader disintegrate. They abandoned the main formation. They forgot the mission. They wanted the ghost. 3109s rolled inverted, diving straight for the lone Spitfire. On the ground, Miller's board was a mess of screaming voices. "Red 2 is engaged. He's got 3 on him. Where is his cover?" "He has no cover," Miller shouted back. "He's on his own." Beurling felt the first hits, a staccato ping-ping-ping of 7.9mm rounds stitching across his starboard wing. The aircraft shuddered. The smell of raw gasoline filled the cockpit. A leak. One spark and he'd be a fireball over the Mediterranean. He didn't break. He didn't dive for the deck. He pulled the stick back into his stomach, kicking the rudder with a violence that made the airframe scream. He forced the Spitfire into a vertical stall, a maneuver that any flight instructor would call suicide. The Spitfire stood on its tail, the Merlin engine coughing, the prop clawing at thin air. The 3 Germans, blinded by their own speed, zoomed past him. They couldn't slow down. They were victims of their own momentum. For 3 seconds, Beurling was suspended in midair, weightless, looking down at the tails of 3 enemy fighters. He fired. The second Messerschmitt's wing root exploded. The limbs sheared off completely, spinning away like a falling leaf. 2. Then the Spitfire fell out of the sky. It wasn't a controlled dive. It was a spin. The world became a blurred centrifuge of blue water and white clouds. The G-force slammed Beurling's head against the side of the canopy. Blood began to leak from his nose. His vision started to gray out, the light receding into a narrow, dark tunnel. "Red 2, respond. George, pull up." Beurling heard the radio, but he couldn't move his arms. They felt like they were made of lead. The sea was rushing up, 4,000 feet, 3,000, 2. He could see the whitecaps. He could see the individual rocks of the coastline. This was the end. This was the screwball legacy. A crater in the water and a footnote in a logbook. But inside the darkness of the gray out, Beurling's brain was still working. He wasn't thinking about death. He was thinking about the rudder trim. At 800 feet, his fingers found the wheel. He cranked it. The Spitfire's nose lurched. The airflow caught the elevators. The plane leveled off so low that the prop wash kicked up a dual wake in the water. The salt spray coated the windshield. Beurling gasped, air finally returning to his lungs. He was shaking so hard his boots were rattling against the floorboards. He looked in his mirrors. The sky behind him was empty. The Germans had climbed away, shaken by the sheer, unpredictable madness of the encounter. He keyed the mic. His voice was flat, almost bored. "Ground, this is Red 2, requesting vector for Tikali. I'm a bit low on petrol." There was a long silence on the other end. No one cheered. No one congratulated him. "Vector received, Red 2, Miller finally said, his voice trembling. "And George?" "Yes? Don't ever do that again." Beurling didn't answer. He was already looking at the sky, calculating the transit of the sun, wondering if there was enough fuel for one more sweep. He was George Beurling. He was the mad sniper of Malta. And he was just getting started. When the Spitfire's tires finally bit into the sun-baked clay of Tikali, the aircraft didn't just land, it collapsed. George Beurling cut the Merlin engine. The sudden silence was violent. It was a physical weight that slammed into his chest, replacing the roar of the slipstream with the frantic, wet thud of his own heart. He didn't move. He couldn't. For 10 minutes, he sat in the glass coffin of the cockpit, his hands locked onto the spade grip of the control stick. Then the tremor started. It wasn't the shaking of a man who had been afraid. It was the neurological protest of a body that had been pushed past the breaking point. His fingers rattled against the metal like dry bone. His legs felt hollow, as if the dysentery had finally hollowed out his marrow and replaced it with nothing but pressurized air. He unstrapped. His knees didn't just buckle, they vanished. A mechanic named Elias lunged forward, catching Beurling's shoulder just as he began to slide off the wing root. Elias recoiled. The pilot didn't feel like a man. He felt like a bundle of hot, vibrating wires. "You're bleeding, sir," Elias whispered, eyes wide. Beurling didn't look at him. He looked through him. He reached up and wiped his mouth. His glove came away soaked in a dark, viscous red. Not from a wound, but from the internal pressure of the high G-turns bursting the capillaries in his nose and throat. "Check the starboard wing," Beurling rasped. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. "Fuel leak. I could smell the high octane the whole way back." Elias stepped back, his face pale. You stayed in the fight with a fuel leak? One tracer, George. One spark, and you're a Roman candle." Beurling didn't answer. He was already walking toward the shade of the revetment, his boots crunching on the red Maltese gravel. Behind him, the ground crew swarmed the aircraft. They didn't find one hole. They found 8. A cluster of 7.9mm rounds had stitched a path less than 3 inches from the main fuel line. Inside the ops room, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of pressure. There was no cheering. In most squadrons, a pilot returning with 2 confirmed kills and a probable was a cause for a toast. In 249 Squadron, it was a cause for a headache. Miller, the controller, stood by the massive wooden table, his eyes fixed on the grease pencil marks. He felt a simmering, low-grade anxiety every time Beurling's name appeared on the board. It wasn't that Beurling was a bad pilot. It was that his excellence was a threat to the very idea of military order. "He broke formation again," a wing commander said, his voice tight. "He left his wingman blind. He's playing a private game while the island burns." "He got 2 109s, Miller countered, though his heart wasn't in the defense. If he'd stayed in the slot, those 109s would have bounced the bombers over the harbor. He stopped the threat. "At the cost of the system, we aren't training snipers, Miller. We're training an air force. If every pilot decides to become a ghost, we have no formation. We have no defense. We just have a dozen lunatics dying alone." This was the core of the Beurling anxiety. Malta was a siege, and a siege requires a collective will. It requires men to be cogs in a machine of survival. But Beurling wasn't a cog. He was a wrench thrown into the gears. He spent his afternoons not in the mess hall, but in the dirt. He would sit for hours behind the hangars, catching lizards with his bare hands. He didn't pet them. He studied them. He watched the way their eyes moved independently, the way they calculated the distance to a fly before they struck. "Why do you do that, screwball?" a young pilot asked one afternoon, watching Beurling hold a green lizard by the tail. Beurling didn't look up. "They don't guess. Look at his eyes. He's not hoping to hit the fly. He's waiting for the fly to commit to a flight path. Once the fly commits, the fly is dead. There's no ego in it, just geometry." The young pilot backed away. He realized then that Beurling didn't see the German pilots as men. He didn't see them as enemies of the crown. He saw them as flies. As October bled into a haze of heat and high explosives, Beurling's geometry became the stuff of nightmares for the Luftwaffe. He had begun to modify his Spitfire in ways that horrified the RAF engineers. He insisted on harmonizing his guns to a point of suicidal proximity. Standard RAF doctrine suggested a convergence point of 250 yards. It gave the pilot a wide shotgun spray that was likely to hit something. Beurling set his at 150 yards. "If I'm at 250 yards, I'm guessing," he told the armorers. "I want my lead and my cannons to meet at a single point. No wider than a man's chest. I don't want to damage the plane. I want to kill the pilot." He was practicing the high deflection snap. It was a maneuver that required a brain capable of processing calculus while the body was being crushed by 6 Gs of force. Most pilots would wait until they were behind the enemy. Beurling would attack from the side, at a 40 or 90-degree angle. The window of opportunity was less than half a second. To anyone else, it was a waste of ammunition. To Beurling, it was the only clean way to kill. Image, a technical diagram showing gun convergence paths, contrasting the wide standard pattern with Beurling's pinpoint pattern. He began to ambush ideas. He stopped looking for planes. He looked for habits. He noticed that the German 109 pilots had a tick. When they were engaged from the left, they almost always broke into a climbing right-hand turn. It was a muscle memory reaction born from the torque of their engines. Beurling didn't follow the turn. He would dive below where he knew they would be 3 seconds later. He was shooting at empty air. And then, as if by some dark magic, a Messerschmitt would fly directly into the stream of fire. The Germans were terrified. In the mess halls of Sicily, the pilots of JG-53, the Ace of Spades wing, started talking about the Gespenst von Malta, the ghost of Malta. They weren't being outflown. They were being executed. They would be flying in a clean four-finger formation, and suddenly the man to their left would simply stop existing. No dogfight, no warning, just a spray of glass and a wing folding like paper. They don't fight like soldiers, one German survivor wrote. They hide in the sun. They fire from angles that shouldn't be possible. It's like being hunted by a sniper in a cathedral. But the Luftwaffe wasn't a collection of amateurs. They were the most experienced air force in the world, and they were learning the screwball signature. By mid-October, they stopped sending lone scouts. They started sending baits. On the morning of the 14th, the sky over the Grand Harbor was a sheet of polished sapphire. Beurling was at 20,000 feet, his Spitfire lagging behind the main squadron as usual. He felt the familiar, gnawing hunger in his gut, the fever chill that told him he had about 20 minutes of consciousness left before the Malta dog claimed him for the day. He saw a lone 109. It was low. It was flying poorly, wobbling as if the pilot was wounded or green. It was a perfect screwball target. Beurling tilted his wing. He felt the familiar surge of the math. Angle 60 degrees. Speed differential 90 knots. He began his dive, but as he centered the crosshairs on the wobbling German, he saw it. A tiny, microscopic flash of silver, miles above him, tucked directly into the heart of the sun. It wasn't one plane, it was 4. The wobbling 109 wasn't a target. It was a worm on a hook. For the first time in his life, the math didn't add up. The hunters had become the hunted. Red 2, break! They're on you! 4 o'clock high! Miller's voice was a scream in his ears, but Beurling was already feeling the impact. Thud, 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 thud. The Spitfire jolted. 20-millimeter cannon shells, the heavy stuff, shredded the fuselage behind his seat. The smell of burning rubber and hot oil flooded the cockpit. His oil pressure gauge didn't just drop. The needle snapped off. The sky around him was suddenly filled with tracers, bright, angry streaks of phosphorus that seemed to be coming from every direction. Beurling hauled the stick back, but the controls felt mushy. The cable was frayed. The Spitfire was dying beneath him. He looked up. The 4 Germans were diving in a perfect box formation, sealing off every escape route. They had studied him. They knew he liked to dive to the deck, so they were cutting him off, forcing him to stay high where they could pick him apart. Beurling felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child in Montreal. He felt a cold, sharp needle of doubt. He was out of altitude. He was out of speed. And for the first time, his math had failed him. He looked at the sea 20,000 feet below. It looked like a slab of cold marble. Not today, he whispered, his teeth bared in a feral grin. Not today, you bastards. He didn't dive. He didn't turn. He shoved the throttle into war emergency power, pushed the nose up directly into the lead German, and closed his eyes. He was going to ram them. The oil pressure needle didn't drop with a dramatic sweep. It twitched, a rhythmic, sickening stutter into the red that signaled the lifeblood of the Merlin was beginning to vent into the Mediterranean air. It wasn't fast enough to cause panic. It was just fast enough to matter. Beurling adjusted the throttle by instinct. His movements were microscopic, his fingers sensing the friction in the linkages as he eased the power back. He was trying to keep the engine from seizing without bleeding off the precious airspeed that was currently his only form of currency. The Spitfire was low, dangerously low, skimming the layer of heavy, salt-laden air that sat just above the waves, and the 3 Messerschmitts pacing him knew he was wounded. They had stopped the wild, aggressive firing of a few minutes ago. They were professionals. They were spreading out now, forming a loose predatory crescent behind his tail, letting gravity and his own bleeding fuel tanks do the heavy lifting. This wasn't a furball. It wasn't the chaotic, adrenaline-soaked scramble of a dogfight. This was a controlled liquidation. Beurling rolled his wings, first left, then a heavy dragging right, testing the aircraft's response. It was sluggish. The Spitfire didn't feel like a predatory bird anymore. It felt like a waterlogged crate. The control stick was heavy, the feedback dull and unresponsive, as if the control cables were moving through thick syrup instead of air. Behind him, a 109 spat a short, rhythmic burst of 7.9mm fire. The tracers didn't aim for his engine. They stitched a line of white light just inches above his canopy. It was a herding tactic. They were pushing him down, forcing him into the denser air, where his engine would overheat faster, narrowing his world until the only thing left was the water. Another Messerschmitt slid into position off his left wing. It was so close that Beurling could see the sun glinting off the pilot's goggles, a faceless, mechanical observer waiting for the inevitable. They were boxing him in. Altitude gone, fuel, a red-stained memory, oil pressure, a steady, dying pulse. This was the standard ending for a pilot over Malta. It wasn't usually a spectacular explosion in the clouds. It was a slow, tightening vice of physics and attrition that eventually left you with no room to breathe and no room to think. But Beurling didn't think about escape. He didn't think about the cold water waiting below. He thought about the geometry of the spiral. He kicked the rudder with a sudden, violent force and rolled the Spitfire into a descending turn that looked like a total loss of control. It looked like surrender. The Germans reacted instantly, the wingman diving to stay on the inside of the turn, while the leader held high, prepared to pounce if Beurling tried to claw back toward the sky. The Mediterranean filled his windscreen, a vast blue sheet of hammered metal rushing up at 300 miles an hour. 1,000 feet. 800. The Spitfire shuddered, the airframe screaming as Beurling hauled back on the stick with everything his emaciated arms had left. He forced a last-ditch, high G climbing snap turn that ripped the remaining speed away from the wings. The aircraft dragged toward a stall, the wings vibrating so hard he thought the rivets would fire out like bullets. The Merlin engine gave a wet, metallic cough, a sound that vibrated directly into his spine. The Germans overshot. Their own momentum carried them past his nose like silver streaks. Except for one. There was a pilot in the group who was better than the rest. He didn't chase the bait. He waited, matching Beurling's vertical climb, letting the Spitfire hang suspended at the apex of its arc. He was waiting for gravity to do its job. Beurling felt the sickening, light-headed weightlessness that meant the wings had stopped generating lift. He was a stone in the sky. He had seconds, maybe less. He didn't wait to fall. He rolled the aircraft inverted, hanging in his straps as the blood rushed to his head, and fired. The shot wasn't clean. It wasn't the surgical precision he prided himself on. It was desperation wrapped in a final, frantic calculation. The 20mm shells tore through the empty blue, searching for a vector, and then they found the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. Smoke and orange flame erupted from the German's nose. The aircraft rolled violently, its flight path breaking as it began a terminal tumble toward the sea, trailing a black ribbon of fire like a signal flare. Beurling didn't watch it hit the water. He couldn't afford the luxury of a kill confirmation. The Merlin sputtered again, a hollow grinding sound, and the oil pressure needle finally buried itself into the red. The fight was over, not because the sky was clear, but because the machine had reached the absolute edge of its endurance. Beurling leveled out just feet above the whitecaps. The prop wash left a dual, foaming wake in the water behind him. The cockpit filled with the acrid, suffocating stench of burning oil and scorched rubber. Thin wisps of black smoke began to curl back from the engine block, obscuring his view of the horizon. If the engine seized now, there would be no glide. There would only be the impact. He set a jagged course for the coast of Malta and prayed, not to a god he didn't believe in, but to the laws of physics. Every vibration through the floorboards felt like a death knell. Every slight change in the engine's pitch sounded like the snapping of a vital bone. Beurling flew with microscopic inputs, holding his breath, afraid that even the weight of his own lungs might be the thing that pushed the Merlin past the point of survival. The pale limestone cliffs of Malta appeared ahead, shimmering through the haze. Then the engine surged. Once, twice. Then it died. The propeller windmilled uselessly, the sudden lack of torque making the aircraft yaw. The roar was replaced by the terrifying, whistling rush of wind over the canopy. The Spitfire was no longer a fighter. It was a 10,000-pound glider, losing speed and lift with every passing second. Beurling shoved the nose down instinctively, trading his last few feet of altitude for enough airspeed to keep the wings from stalling. Takali was miles away. He wasn't going to make the runway. He aimed for the island itself, any patch of land that wasn't a vertical cliff. The fields of Malta rushed up to meet him, low stone walls, parched scrub, and the jagged scars of bomb craters. He picked the flattest stretch of brown earth he could see and committed. There would be no second attempt, no go-around. The Spitfire hit the ground with a bone-jarring impact. The landing gear collapsed instantly, the struts snapping like dry twigs. The aircraft skidded on its belly, metal screaming against rock, the cockpit filling with a blinding cloud of red dust and acrid smoke. Beurling braced his head against the rest as the world lurched violently sideways, the wingtip digging into a stone wall before the fuselage finally slammed to a dead stop. Silence. For several seconds, Beurling didn't move. He sat in the wreckage, his lungs burning, waiting for the bloom of fire that usually followed a belly landing. It didn't come. When he finally fumbled with the harness and crawled out of the shattered canopy, his legs simply vanished beneath him. He dropped to his knees in the dirt beside the mangled wing, retching violently. The dysentery tore through his gut with a fresh, merciless wave of agony. His vision swam with gray spots. Ground crews reached him minutes later, sprinting across the field with weapons drawn, eyes darting to the sky in fear of a strafing pass that never came. They stopped when they saw the wreck. Then they looked at the pilot, a skeletal figure covered in oil, blood, and red dust. "How the hell did you live through that, George?" one of them finally asked, his voice hushed. Beurling didn't answer. He didn't even look at the man. He was already staring back at the sky, his bright, haunted eyes fixed on the empty blue where the Messerschmitts had been just moments earlier. The near-fatal engagement changed the atmosphere on the island. It wasn't just another crash. Word spread through the mess halls and the underground hangars. Red 2 had been shot up, hunted to the deck, and forced to bury his plane in the dirt. For a few hours, there was a quiet, guilty sense of relief among the command staff. They hoped the Beurling problem had finally solved itself, that he would be grounded, sent to a hospital, or shipped back to a desk in Canada. They hoped the ghost would finally stay in the shadows. Instead, George Beurling reported for duty the very next morning at 5 a.m. He was thinner. He was paler. His eyes were sunken so deep into his skull that he looked like a corpse that had forgotten to stop walking. The medics protested, citing his fever and his weight loss. The commanders argued about his instability. The grounding paperwork began to circulate once more through the bureaucracy of the RAF. Then the air raid sirens began their rhythmic, mournful wail. The Luftwaffe was back. And while the officers were still arguing over the ink on the documents, George Beurling was already climbing into the cockpit of a fresh Spitfire. This time, the Germans didn't underestimate him. They brought more aircraft. They coordinated their dives with cold, Teutonic precision. They hunted him deliberately, making him the center of every engagement. And still, somehow, the math held. He kept killing them. At first, the Germans didn't give him a name. To the intelligence officers at Luftwaffe headquarters in Sicily, George Beurling wasn't a man yet. He was a statistical anomaly. He was a glitch in the machine of their conquest. On the giant plotting tables in their darkened command rooms, Beurling was a cluster of red grease pencil marks that appeared too frequently, too violently, and too consistently over a single square mile of contested sky. The combat reports filing in from the survivors of JG-53 and JG-77 made no sense when read side by side. One pilot claimed he had been attacked by a Spitfire firing from an impossible 90-degree deflection. Another described his wingman's cockpit disintegrating without ever seeing an enemy aircraft on his tail. A third, shaking as he spoke to the debriefing officer, swore that the same RAF fighter had appeared twice in the same engagement, attacking from the cellar of the clouds and then, mere seconds later, screaming down from the attic of the sun. Intelligence assumed it was the Malta fever. Fear does strange things to the human mind. Malta was a meat grinder, a limestone rock that swallowed planes and men whole. They assumed the German pilots were imagining patterns because chaos is easier to survive when it feels intentional. It's less terrifying to believe in a ghost than to believe in a math problem you can't solve. Then the losses became impossible to ignore. Day after day, Messerschmitts failed to return to the dirt strips of Sicily. These weren't the sweeping losses of a grand air battle. These were clinical extractions. One aircraft here, two there. Always clean kills. Always fast. Always without a single word of warning on the radio. And always the wreckage was found in positions that contradicted every piece of established RAF doctrine. The Germans began to map him. They overlaid combat times, altitudes, and approach vectors until a shape began to emerge from the data. One aircraft wasn't flying like the others. One pilot was consistently breaking formation, ignoring the big wing climbs, and abandoning his escorts. He wasn't chasing aircraft. He was positioning himself where aircraft would inevitably be forced to go. A sniper doesn't hunt a deer by running through the woods. He waits at the only stream where the deer has no choice but to drink. By the midsummer of 1942, the tone of the Luftwaffe briefings changed. The arrogance was replaced by a cold professional caution. Pilots were warned about isolated Spitfires operating at non-standard altitudes. It was a sanitized bureaucratic phrase, a way to avoid admitting that a single Canadian pilot was starting to dictate the movement of the entire German air arm. But the implication was a jagged pill to swallow. German flight leaders began instructing their men to never descend alone, to maintain extreme vertical separation, to never assume an unescorted Spitfire was a target of opportunity. Those instructions saved German lives, but they cost the Luftwaffe their most lethal weapon, speed. The air war over Malta had relied on aggression, fast dives, quick kills, and rapid disengagement. Beurling had disrupted that rhythm. Every moment a German pilot spent checking his blind six was a second he wasn't looking at his target. Every second of hesitation gave Malta room to breathe. Inside the RAF command, Beurling had become a liability wrapped in a legend. Every sortie he flew ended in one of two ways: a German plane at the bottom of the sea, or George Beurling nearly dead in a pile of scrap metal. His commanders began tracking him separately. They didn't put it on paper. The paperwork was already a mountain of grounding orders and medical complaints. But in every morning briefing, there was an unspoken question hanging in the air. Where is Beurling going today, and how is he going to ruin our formation to get his kill? Beurling refused to answer. He didn't brief well. He didn't debrief at all. His reports were sparse, technical, and almost insulting in their brevity. Altitudes, angles, ammunition count, no emotion, no storytelling, no heroics. Other pilots talked about the adrenaline and the fear. Beurling only talked about the math, and the math was becoming lethal. One morning, just as the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, the Luftwaffe tried to break the ghost. Instead of diving from the heights, they came in low, skimming the whitecaps of the Mediterranean, using the morning glare and the sea haze to mask their silhouettes. It was a deliberate inversion of their tactics, designed to pull the RAF fighters down into a horizontal, turning fight where the Spitfire's edge over the 109 was razor thin. The trap was obvious to anyone with a week of combat experience. The RAF commanders ordered the squadron to stay high, but the pressure of the incoming bombers was too much. The squadron dropped to meet them, their radios a screaming mess of warnings and shouted corrections. Beurling turned his radio off. He didn't drop. He did the opposite. He climbed alone to 30,000 feet, his Merlin engine straining in the thin, freezing air. He sat in the silence of the stratosphere, watching the entire geometry of the battle unfold beneath him like a diagram on a chalkboard. The Germans thought they had removed his altitude advantage by staying low. They hadn't. They had given him something much better: predictability. As the Messerschmitts finished their initial passes and began to climb back up, their engines hot, their airspeed bleeding away as they clawed for height, Beurling rolled his Spitfire, inverted and dropped. The first German never even saw the sun flicker. He was dead before the sound of Beurling's cannons reached his ears. The second pilot tried to brake, but his wings were mushy in the climb. He had no energy left to fight the G-force. He became a stationary target in a moving sky. The third German fired wildly into the blue, his tracers arching uselessly into the void. Beurling fired 3 bursts in under 20 seconds. 3 aircraft fell. On the ground, the RAF controllers stared at the radar plots in a stunned, suffocating silence. The engagement had lasted less than 2 minutes. The Germans didn't just disengage, they fled. They retreated east in a shattered, uncoordinated mess, making no attempt to reform. That afternoon, for the first time in weeks, the Luftwaffe stopped flying over Malta. Not officially, but in practice. They waited. When they returned days later, they brought a new kind of war. They brought layered escorts, weaving patterns of fighters stacked at 3 different altitudes, designed specifically to deny any blind spots. It was textbook counter-sniper doctrine. Force the predator to reveal himself by giving him too many eyes to hide from. Beurling didn't reveal himself. He adapted faster than they could write the new orders. He became selective, terrifyingly so. He stopped firing when the shots weren't perfect. He let Germans pass if the angle wasn't a clean kill. He ignored damaged aircraft that would have been easy tallies for any other pilot because chasing them risked exposure. The pilots on both sides began to notice something unsettling. Beurling wasn't trying to win dogfights anymore. He was trying to survive them just long enough to execute the person in front of him. One German ace, a man with 20 kills on the Eastern Front, made the mistake of assuming Beurling was reckless. He saw the lone Spitfire and dove aggressively, confident that his experience would carry the day. Beurling didn't turn to meet him. He reversed beneath the German, pulling a maneuver that should have snapped his airframe, and fired a single burst at extreme deflection. The German's wing didn't just smoke, it folded inward like a broken fan. The aircraft disintegrated midair. Later, the intelligence officers who reviewed the gun camera footage realized Beurling had fired for less than 1 second. The kill zone, the area where his bullets converged, was less than a meter wide. He had aimed for the pilot's seat, and he hadn't missed by an inch. From that day forward, the Luftwaffe briefings referred to a specific threat, not by name, by behavior. An RAF pilot operating independently, extreme deflection, engagement discouraged. It was an admission of defeat. George Beurling had done something few pilots in the history of warfare ever achieve. He had altered the enemy's fundamental doctrine through the sheer terror of his accuracy. But the cost was being paid in blood and bone. The Germans began to bait him. They flew crippled aircraft deliberately low, dangling the kill like a worm on a hook, knowing Beurling's obsession with finishing what he started. Once, it almost worked. He chased a wounded 109 too far, dropping into a dead zone where a hidden section of Messerschmitts was waiting in the clouds. Beurling felt the hits before he heard them. The cockpit filled with the blinding sting of white smoke. His canopy shattered, raining shards of perspex into his lap. His left leg went numb as shrapnel tore through the thin metal of his seat. He still pulled out. Barely. When he landed back at Takali, the medics had to pull his hands off the controls by force. He was clinging to the rim of the cockpit like a drowning man, his teeth chattering so hard he couldn't form words. "I'm fine," he finally managed to rasp, even as the blood began to soak through the fabric of his boots. "I just need water." He didn't tell them that his vision was tunneling. He didn't tell them that the math was starting to blur. The RAF began quietly rotating pilots away from his squadron. It wasn't because they hated him. It was because being near George Beurling increased the probability of death. He was a lightning rod, and no one wanted to be standing next to him when the strike came. Beurling didn't care. He flew whenever they let him. He killed with a frequency that strained the record-keeping of the clerks. They double-checked his claims not because they doubted him, but because the numbers stopped making intuitive sense. How could one man rotting from dysentery and shaking from fever be more lethal than an entire squadron of healthy pilots? By the time the official tallies caught up, George Beurling was the most lethal Allied pilot in the Mediterranean. He was also the loneliest man on Earth. The Germans knew his habits, the British knew his value, and Beurling himself existed in the narrow, freezing space between obsession and total physical collapse. He was burning through his own life faster than the war could burn through the sky. The question was no longer whether the Luftwaffe would stop him. It was whether George Beurling would survive long enough to finally stop himself. The end didn't arrive with a fanfare or a final, climactic dogfight. There was no single morning where the commanders stood over the plotting tables and declared that the breaking point had been reached. Instead, the war over Malta simply began to blur. Time lost its linearity. The kills started coming with a frequency that defied the standard mechanics of reporting. Sorties overlapped, claims stacked on top of claims. Confirmations arrived from ground observers like delayed echoes of a scream. In the hangars at Takali, the ground crew stopped erasing the small white chalk marks under Beurling's cockpit between flights. There was no point. The paint wouldn't have time to dry before the next tally was added. In the operations rooms, clerks began penciling numbers into the narrow white margins of the logbooks because the official columns had run out of space. The other pilots stopped asking Beurling how many he had shot down over breakfast. They started asking a much darker, quieter question in the corners of the mess hall. How long can a human being actually do this? Because Beurling wasn't doing what the others were. He wasn't staying airborne longer than the rest of the squadron. He wasn't chasing deeper into enemy airspace over Sicily. He wasn't taking more risks. He was just finishing faster. One morning he dropped 2 machis in a single diving pass before the rest of his formation had even finished their initial bank. Another afternoon he fired from a range so impossibly close that when the Spitfire was rolled back into the revetment, the mechanics found jagged fragments of German canopy glass embedded in the leading edge of his wings, trophies of a collision that had missed by inches. On one frantic Tuesday, he landed with less than 5 minutes of fuel in his tanks, logged a confirmed kill, drank a liter of lukewarm water until he vomited in the dust, and climbed back into a fresh aircraft before his hands had even stopped shaking. The Germans noticed the acceleration. The air war over Malta, once a marathon of attrition, was being compressed into a series of violent 5-minute spasms. Luftwaffe pilots grew jumpy. They began aborting dives before they reached the target. They fired their cannons too early, spraying expensive 20mm rounds into the empty blue. They climbed away from engagements when nothing was even there. Every unexplained hit, every wingman who vanished into a ball of fire without a radio call, fed a growing black superstition. If you can't see the ghost, he can already see you. But Beurling didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a man being slowly erased from the world. His face hollowed out until the skin of his cheekbones looked like parchment stretched over stone. His flight suit, once snug, hung off his frame in pathetic, oily folds. He drank constantly, a frantic, unquenchable thirst. And yet he remained dangerously dehydrated. The dysentery never truly left his system. It simply receded into the background, a dull, thumping ache that allowed him just enough strength to hold a stick. His hands trembled with a violent, rhythmic palsy the moment he wasn't holding the spade grip. His sleep, when it came at all, was broken into 30-minute fragments of nightmare, filled with the geometry he couldn't turn off. Angles, closure rates, the fatal curve of a parabola. He stopped talking about what he would do after the war. He stopped talking about Canada. He stopped talking to people entirely. In the mess hall, he was a silent, skeletal presence, his bright blue eyes fixed on some point in the distance that no one else could see. In the air, however, the decay of the body seemed to feed the perfection of the mind. It was as if every other system in his biology was being liquidated, their energy diverted to the single part of his brain that solved 3-dimensional problems of death. On a late October afternoon, the Luftwaffe attempted their most sophisticated attack of the campaign, a coordinated, multi-layered box of fighters and bombers designed to overwhelm the radar controllers. It was a masterpiece of Teutonic planning. Beurling ignored it. He didn't go for the bombers. He didn't engage the high-cover Messerschmitts. He positioned himself beneath the low-level escorts and waited. He waited for the exact second they peeled away to intercept the RAF's primary wing, and then he climbed into the quiet second, the gap in the air they had left behind. One by one, the German fighters rolled to engage targets that didn't exist. Beurling was already there. He fired once, then again, then a third time. 3 aircraft fell into the Mediterranean in 90 seconds. The rest of the German formation, seeing their screen disintegrate from the inside out, broke and fled. That evening, a British intelligence officer pinned a new marker on the wall map. He drew a circle around a series of coordinates. Inside that circle were the same altitudes, the same approach angles, the same timestamps. The pattern wasn't just repetitive, it was becoming a signature. They weren't watching a pilot fly a mission. They were watching a man refine a method of execution. The Luftwaffe tried saturation next. They sent more planes, tightened their spacing, and drilled mutual support into every pilot's head. It forced Beurling to fire less often, but it didn't make him miss. He stopped wasting bursts. He waited until the enemy was fully committed to a maneuver, until the cost of escaping was higher than the cost of staying. German pilots began to refer to the moment they realized he was in the sky as die stille Sekunde, the quiet second. It was the instant when the radio chatter suddenly died, when the sky felt wrong, when a formation tightened instinctively for no reason they could put into words. It was the feeling of a predator's eyes on the back of your neck. Some men survived that second, most didn't. Beurling's tally climbed past numbers that belonged to myths. He surpassed the aces who had flown longer tours and safer rotations. He did it while starving. He did it while sick. He did it while defending an island that the rest of the world had already written off as a graveyard. And still, he flew. Until one morning he didn't. The sirens wailed at 5:30. The ground crew prepped his Spitfire. But when Beurling reached for his goggles, a hand reached out and stopped him. It wasn't the Luftwaffe that finally got him. It was the bureaucracy. The RAF command had intervened. They called it a necessary rotation. They called it rest. They called it a lot of things to avoid saying the truth, that they were afraid of what George Beurling was becoming. Beurling didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He stood in the commander's office, his jaw clenched, staring at the men across the desk as if they were variables in an equation he was trying to solve. "You've done enough, George," a wing commander said softly. Beurling shook his head. "There's no such thing as enough, not as long as the math is still working." They grounded him anyway. The siege of Malta eventually loosened. The Luftwaffe moved their focus elsewhere. The supply ships began to arrive. The island began to breathe again, the red dust settling on the bomb craters. George Beurling left the island with no parade. There were no speeches from the governor. He left with a number written in ink, a tally of kills that felt too clean, too sterile, to represent the physical and mental rot it had cost to achieve them. In the years that followed, people would argue about the screwball legacy. They would debate whether he was a brilliant marksman or a broken psychopath. They would wonder if he was a disciplined warrior or a dangerous loner, whose methods should be buried along with the war. But over the scorched rock of Malta, in that thin, freezing band of sky where the air is too thin to breathe and mistakes are final, none of that mattered. What mattered was that for a brief, violent span of months, the sky belonged to one man who refused to follow the rules of the living, a man who turned a dogfight into a laboratory, who treated enemy pilots like trajectories, who stepped into the silence and made it lethal. George Beurling didn't save Malta alone. No one man could. But when the pressure peaked, when the fuel was gone and the oil was bleeding and the math of survival had stopped favoring the defenders, he bent the numbers just enough to keep the island alive. And then he disappeared into the blue, leaving behind a sky that felt empty, a series of questions that would never be answered, and a tally that no one, not then and not since, would ever match again.